February 20th, 1945. The volcanic island of Iwo Jima rose from the Pacific Ocean like a fortress of black sand and stone, its beaches defended by 21,000 soldiers of the Japanese Imperial Army entrenched in miles of tunnels and bunkers carved deep into the rock. At 0600 hours, as the first waves of Marines approached the southeastern shores, Japanese commanders observed through their scopes with confidence born from 2 years of preparation. They had turned every inch of this 8-square-mile island into a killing ground, constructed 1,500 defensive positions connected by 11 miles of underground tunnels, stockpiled ammunition and supplies sufficient for 5 months of sustained combat, and trained their forces to exact maximum casualties from any invasion force. They believed no force on Earth could take it quickly, and their confidence was not entirely misplaced. American intelligence estimated the island might take up to 7 days to capture, a prediction that would prove catastrophically optimistic. They were about to discover something that would shake their understanding of their enemy. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What unfolded on those black volcanic beaches would shatter Japanese assumptions about American resolve, reveal capabilities they had not anticipated, and tell a story of courage that had been deliberately hidden from the American public itself. A story about men who fought for a country that refused to grant them full citizenship. Men who proved their worth on the most deadly battlefield of the Pacific Campaign. The months leading up to the invasion had been filled with meticulous preparation. American military planners understood that Iwo Jima represented a strategic prize of immense value. The island sat almost exactly halfway between the Mariana Islands, where American forces had established major air bases, and the Japanese home islands. Heavy bombers attacking Japan from the Marianas flew missions that lasted 14 hours round trip without fighter escort, as American fighters lacked the range to accompany them all the way to targets and back. Fighters based on Iwo Jima could provide that escort. Even more critically, bombers damaged over Japan needed an emergency landing site closer than the Marianas. The ocean crossing was simply too far for aircraft with battle damage or mechanical problems. Thousands of American airmen would die in the Pacific Ocean if Iwo Jima remained in Japanese hands. The island had to be taken, regardless of cost. The 592 men of the 8th Marine Ammunition Company had no illusions about what awaited them. They were support troops, logistics specialists trained to haul supplies under fire, and every single one of them was African American. In 1945, the United States Marine Corps still operated under strict segregation, relegating black Marines to labor battalions while white Marines received the glory of combat roles. The men of the 8th Ammunition Company had enlisted to fight for their country, only to be told they would carry boxes instead of rifles into battle. Their white officers believed they lacked the courage for combat. The Japanese defenders of Iwo Jima believed the beach they protected was impenetrable. Both groups were about to learn the same lesson about underestimating human determination. The formation of the 8th Ammunition Company had begun 8 months earlier at Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, in the segregated section known as Montford Point. This was where the Marine Corps trained all its black recruits, isolated from white Marines, and subjected to training that was deliberately more rigorous, more demanding, and more demeaning than what their white counterparts experienced. The logic, such as it was, held that if black Marines were going to be allowed in the Corps at all, they would have to be twice as good to be considered half as worthy. The instructors at Montford Point were predominantly white drill instructors who had volunteered for the assignment, some because they believed in giving black men a fair chance to prove themselves, others because they wanted to prove that black men would fail under pressure. Sergeant Timms Washington had arrived at Montford Point in June of 1944, one of 60 recruits in his training class. He had grown up in Birmingham, Alabama, where his father worked in the steel mills and his mother cleaned houses for white families. The Washington family lived in a shotgun house in a segregated neighborhood where the streets remained unpaved, decades after the white sections of town had been modernized. Timms had worked alongside his father in the mills from age 14, developing the physical strength and endurance that would serve him well in the Marines. He had also developed something else in those mills, a quiet, burning determination to prove that he was as capable as any man. regardless of what society told him about his place in the world. The decision to enlist had not been popular with his family. His father had served in the army during the First World War, part of the all-black 92nd Infantry Division that had been sent to France and then largely left to rot in rear area assignments while white units received the opportunity to fight. He returned home to Alabama to find that nothing had changed, that his military service counted for precisely nothing in a society determined to keep him in his assigned place. He had discouraged Timms from enlisting, arguing that the military would use him and discard him just as it had used and discarded thousands of black soldiers before. But Timms Washington had watched the newsreels from the Pacific, had seen the Marines storming beaches and raising flags, and had felt something stir in him that could not be denied. He wanted to be part of something larger than himself. He wanted to test himself in the most extreme circumstances imaginable. And perhaps most importantly, he wanted to make it impossible for anyone to claim that he had not served when his country called, even if that country refused to grant him full citizenship. He enlisted 3 days after his 22nd birthday, took the oath at the recruiting station in Birmingham, and boarded a bus to North Carolina with 12 other young black men from the Alabama region. The training at Montford Point had been brutal. The physical training was more intense than what white Marines endured, with longer runs, more push-ups, more everything. The drill instructors seemed to take particular pleasure in finding ways to make life difficult for the recruits. They conducted surprise inspections at 2 in the morning, rejecting entire barracks for microscopic infractions. They led forced marches in full gear through swamps in summer heat. They created obstacle courses, specifically designed to be nearly impossible to complete, then punished entire platoons when individual recruits failed to finish. The message was clear: you have to be perfect, and even then, you will not be good enough. Washington had endured it all with the same quiet determination he had learned in the Birmingham steel mills. When drill instructors screamed in his face, he remained at attention and took it. When the entire platoon was punished for his failure to perfectly align his footlocker, he apologized to his fellow recruits and ensured it never happened again. When a white drill instructor from Mississippi told him flatly that Negroes had no business being Marines, Washington had simply replied, "Then I guess I will have to prove I belong here, sir." The instructor had made Washington's life particularly miserable for the next 6 weeks, but Washington had refused to quit, refused to give the man the satisfaction of seeing him break. What sustained Washington through those months of training was the knowledge that he was not alone. The other black Marines in his platoon were enduring the same treatment, facing the same discrimination, carrying the same burden of needing to be twice as good, to be considered half as worthy. They formed bonds that went deeper than ordinary military camaraderie. They were fighting not just to become Marines, but to prove that they had the right to be Marines, to demonstrate that the color of their skin had no bearing on their capability or courage. Every man who graduated from Montford Point represented a small victory against a system designed to exclude them. Corporal James Mitchell had come to Montford Point from Baltimore, where he had worked on the docks loading cargo ships. He was 23 years old, powerfully built from years of manual labor, and possessed a natural leadership ability that quickly made him stand out among the recruits. Mitchell had 3 younger brothers, all of whom looked up to him as a role model. When he enlisted in the Marines, his brothers had been excited, imagining him in combat against the Japanese, winning glory for the family. Mitchell had not had the heart to tell them that black Marines were not allowed in combat roles, that he would spend his service loading trucks and stacking supplies. He figured they would learn the truth eventually, and perhaps by then he would have found some way to make his service meaningful, despite the restrictions placed upon him. During training, Mitchell had excelled at everything, except keeping his opinions to himself. He had a tendency to question orders that seemed designed purely to harass rather than train, and this had earned him extra punishment details and the hostile attention of several drill instructors. But Mitchell's physical capabilities were so impressive that even the most prejudiced instructors had to acknowledge his competence. He could march for hours with a full pack without showing fatigue. He could disassemble and reassemble weapons faster than most of his peers. He could navigate obstacle courses that left other recruits exhausted and defeated. His leadership qualities were obvious. Other recruits naturally looked to him for guidance and encouragement. It was Mitchell who organized study groups to help recruits who struggled with the written tests required for graduation. It was Mitchell who encouraged exhausted Marines to push through the final miles of forced marches. It was Mitchell who stood up to a white corporal who had been stealing rations from black Marines, confronting the man directly, despite knowing it could result in severe punishment. The corporal had backed down, recognizing that Mitchell was not someone who would be intimidated or pushed around. That incident had earned Mitchell respect from both black and white Marines, and had demonstrated the kind of courage that had nothing to do with combat, but everything to do with character. Private First Class. Harold Thompson was the youngest member of what would become the 8th Ammunition Company's core leadership group. He was only 19 years old when he completed training at Montford Point, fresh-faced and eager, despite everything the Marine Corps had thrown at him. Thompson had grown up in Detroit, where his father ran a small grocery store that served the black community. The store had been a gathering place where men discussed politics, shared news, and debated what role black Americans should play in the conflict that was consuming the world. Thompson's father had been skeptical about the conflict, arguing that black Americans had no stake in a fight between white empires, but Harold had seen it differently. He had argued with his father late into many nights, insisting that black Americans had to participate in the conflict effort, had to demonstrate their patriotism and capability if they were ever going to achieve full equality. His father had eventually relented, giving Harold his blessing to enlist but extracting a promise. You come home, you do whatever they ask you to do, you serve with honor, and you come home to your family. That is all I ask. Thompson had taken that promise seriously. He approached his training with focused intensity, determined not just to pass, but to excel. He studied the Marine Corps manual late into the night, while other recruits slept. He practiced his marksmanship on his own time, even though black Marines were rarely issued ammunition for training. He memorized supply procedures and logistics protocols, figuring that if he was going to be relegated to support duties, he would be the best support Marine the Corps had ever seen. His dedication had paid off. He graduated third in his class of 60 recruits, earning him promotion to Private First Class and a leadership position in the newly formed 8th Ammunition Company. The 8th Ammunition Company itself was created in November of 1944, as the Marines prepared for the invasion of Iwo Jima. The Corps needed logistics units that could operate under fire, moving supplies from ship to shore, and then to forward positions in combat zones. Previous campaigns had revealed the critical importance of logistics. The most capable combat units in the world were useless if they ran out of ammunition, water, or rations. The decision to use black Marines for this critical role was both pragmatic and prejudiced. Pragmatic because the job genuinely required skilled, disciplined troops who could operate under extreme pressure. Prejudiced because the Marine Corps leadership still refused to fully integrate black Marines into combat roles, preferring to maintain segregation even as evidence mounted that it was militarily inefficient. Lieutenant James Davis had been assigned as the company's executive officer, serving under a captain who made no secret of his belief that black Marines were inferior soldiers. Davis was 26 years old, a graduate of the University of Wisconsin who had been commissioned through Officer Training School in 1943. Unlike many white officers assigned to black units, Davis had volunteered for the position. He had grown up in a working-class family in Milwaukee, where his father had been a union organizer who believed in equality and had taught his children that discrimination was morally wrong and practically stupid. Davis brought those beliefs with him into the Marine Corps, where they made him unpopular with some fellow officers, but earned him the trust and respect of the black Marines he led. Davis spent the months before Iwo Jima training his company relentlessly. He understood that they would face skepticism from white Marines, that they would be judged more harshly than white troops, that any failure would be attributed to their race rather than to individual shortcomings. He pushed them hard, conducting training exercises that simulated combat conditions as closely as possible. They practiced moving supplies across obstacles under time pressure. They rehearsed setting up ammunition dumps in exposed positions. They drilled on casualty evacuation procedures. They learned to work as a coordinated team where every man knew his job and could perform it under pressure. But Davis also did something else. He treated his Marines with respect. He learned their names, their backgrounds, their motivations for enlisting. He listened when they had concerns or suggestions. He stood up for them when white officers or NCOs treated them poorly. He ensured they received the same quality equipment and rations as white Marines, fighting through layers of bureaucracy when supplies mysteriously failed to arrive for his unit. His Marines noticed, and they responded by giving him their complete loyalty and maximum effort. They would have followed Lieutenant Davis into hell itself, because they knew he saw them as Marines first and would never ask them to do anything he wouldn't do himself. Sergeant Timms Washington stood on the deck of the transport ship USS Middleton as dawn broke over the Pacific, watching the massive naval bombardment that had pounded Iwo Jima for 3 consecutive days. He was 24 years old, born in Birmingham, Alabama, where he had worked in the steel mills before enlisting. Around him, the other men of the 8th Ammunition Company checked their gear with the practiced efficiency of troops who knew their job inside and out. They wore the same uniforms as white Marines, carried the same equipment, but wore it with the knowledge that back home, many of them could not vote, could not eat at certain restaurants, could not even drink from the same water fountains as the men who commanded them. "Think this will be the one where they finally let us show what we can do?" asked Corporal James Mitchell, a former dock worker from Baltimore who had joined the Marines with his 3 brothers. All 3 had been assigned to segregated labor units. Washington did not answer immediately. He had learned in 2 years of service that hope was a luxury that could be crushed as easily as any other. Instead, he focused on the practical reality before them. Their mission was simple on paper: follow the assault waves onto the beach, establish ammunition dumps, and keep the frontline Marines supplied with everything they needed to push inland. It was dangerous work that required them to shuttle back and forth across beaches under constant fire, but it was not considered real combat by the Marine Corps leadership. Lieutenant James Davis, one of the few white officers who treated his black Marines with respect, gathered the company for a final briefing. "Listen up. Intelligence says the Japanese have 1,700 pillboxes and fortified positions on this island. The beach we are landing on, Beach Red 2, has been designated as a critical resupply point. The assault waves go in first, establish a beachhead, and we follow 20 minutes behind. Our job is to get ammunition, water, rations, and medical supplies from ship to shore and distributed to forward positions. This is not guard duty back in San Diego. This is as real as it gets." The men absorbed this in silence. They had heard similar briefings before other operations, Saipan, Tinian, Guam, and every time they had performed their duties under fire, while white Marines received the medals and newspaper coverage. But Iwo Jima was different. Even from the ship, they could see the island was like nothing they had encountered before. It rose steeply from the water, dominated by a 546-foot extinct volcano called Mount Suribachi, that gave Japanese artillery observers a perfect view of every inch of the landing beaches. The beaches themselves were not sand, but volcanic ash and cinders that shifted under every step, making it nearly impossible to dig foxholes or move vehicles. At 0900 hours, the first wave of assault Marines hit the beaches. From the ships, the men of the 8th Ammunition Company watched as landing craft deposited Marines onto the black sand and then struggled to retract from the beach as their propellers churned uselessly in the loose volcanic material. For the first 10 minutes, the landing appeared unopposed. Not a single shot was fired. The Japanese were waiting. The Japanese commander of Iwo Jima's defenses was Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, a career military officer who had studied in the United States before the conflict and understood American industrial and military capabilities better than most of his peers. Kuribayashi had been given command of Iwo Jima, with explicit orders from Tokyo to defend the island to the last man, making the Americans pay such a horrific price that they would reconsider their strategy of island hopping toward the Japanese homeland. He had taken those orders seriously and spent 2 years transforming the island into a fortress unlike anything the Americans had encountered in previous Pacific campaigns. Kuribayashi's defensive strategy was built on several principles that differed dramatically from previous Japanese tactics. First, he abandoned the traditional doctrine of defending at the water's edge and counter-attacking to throw invaders back into the sea. Previous battles had demonstrated that American naval and air power could annihilate forces that exposed themselves on beaches. Instead, Kuribayashi positioned his forces in depth, creating killing zones that would allow his troops to fire on the beaches from protected positions while remaining safe from American bombardment. Second, he forbade the suicidal banzai charges that had characterized Japanese tactics in previous battles. Every soldier was ordered to kill 10 Americans before dying, and reckless charges that wasted Japanese lives without inflicting maximum American casualties were prohibited. Third, he emphasized the construction of underground fortifications that could survive the heaviest bombardment. The result of Kuribayashi's strategy was an island transformed into a fortress on a scale that American intelligence had failed to fully appreciate. The 11 miles of tunnels connected defensive positions so that Japanese troops could move from one firing position to another without exposing themselves to American fire. Artillery pieces were mounted on rails inside caves, allowing them to be rolled out to fire and then withdrawn before American counter-battery fire could target them. Every cave entrance and tunnel opening had multiple layers of protection, often including several feet of reinforced concrete. The volcanic rock of Iwo Jima itself provided natural protection that was nearly impossible to penetrate even with the heaviest weapons. Kuribayashi had also carefully studied American tactics from previous island campaigns. He understood that Americans relied heavily on overwhelming firepower, using naval bombardment and airstrikes to soften up defenses before sending troops ashore. He designed his fortifications to survive such bombardment and remain operational. He understood that Americans valued speed and momentum, trying to push inland quickly before defenders could organize. He planned to slow them down, forcing them to fight for every yard of ground, exhausting them physically and psychologically. He understood that Americans were sensitive to casualties, and he designed his defenses to inflict maximum losses while minimizing Japanese exposure. Most critically, Kuribayashi understood something that other Japanese commanders had missed. American logistical superiority was not just about quantity, but about the quality and training of the forces performing logistics duties. He had observed in reports from previous battles that American supply lines functioned smoothly even under fire, that ammunition and supplies flowed forward consistently, that American forces rarely suffered from shortages even during extended operations. He attributed this to American industrial capacity, but failed to fully appreciate the human element, the training and discipline of the logistics troops who made that supply chain function. This blind spot would prove significant, though perhaps not in ways he anticipated. On the Japanese side, racial assumptions also played a role in their defensive planning. Japanese military doctrine in 1945 was heavily influenced by the belief that the American military was weakened by racial diversity, that forces composed of different ethnic groups would lack cohesion and determination. Intelligence reports circulating through Japanese command structures portrayed American society as fractured by racial tensions, suggesting that Black Americans would be unwilling to fight for a country that discriminated against them. Some Japanese officers believed that the presence of black troops in American forces actually represented a weakness that could be exploited, that these troops would fight poorly or even defect if given the opportunity. These assumptions were about to be tested against the reality of men like Sergeant Washington, Corporal Mitchell, and Private Thompson, men who had endured discrimination their entire lives and responded not with weakness, but with a determination to prove their worth through excellence. The Japanese defenders were preparing to face what they believed would be a racially divided enemy. They were about to discover that shared hardship and shared purpose could create bonds that transcended the racial divisions of American society. Then the entire island seemed to erupt. Japanese artillery hidden in the caves of Mount Suribachi opened fire with devastating accuracy. Mortar rounds walked across the beach in precise patterns. Machine gun fire from invisible pillboxes carved through the exposed Marines. Within minutes, the black sand beach was transformed into chaos as Marines desperately tried to find cover in terrain that offered none. Landing craft attempting to retreat were hit and disabled, creating obstacles for subsequent waves. The volcanic sand absorbed men up to their knees, making every movement exhausting and leaving them completely exposed. "That is where we are going," Mitchell said quietly, watching the carnage unfold through binoculars. "That is where we are going," Washington confirmed. At 09:20, the 8th Ammunition Company received the order to load into their landing craft. They would be among the first support units to hit the beach, arriving while the assault was still in its chaotic initial phase. Each man carried full combat gear, plus the first loads of ammunition they would transport inland. They climbed down the cargo nets into the Higgins boats that would carry them to shore, the sound of naval gunfire and distant explosions providing a constant soundtrack. The ride to the beach took 12 minutes. 12 minutes during which every man dealt with the knowledge of what was waiting in his own way. Some prayed, some checked their weapons repeatedly, some stared at the steel walls of the landing craft in silence. Washington spent the time thinking about something his grandfather had told him before he enlisted. His grandfather had been born enslaved in 1858, had lived to see emancipation, and had watched his grandson prepare to fight for a country that still treated him as a second-class citizen. "You do not fight for them," his grandfather had said. "You fight so they cannot say you would not. You fight so your children will not have to prove the same thing." The landing craft hit the beach with a grinding crunch. The ramp dropped, and the men of the 8th Ammunition Company rushed out into hell. The volcanic sand immediately swallowed their boots, making every step a struggle. The beach was crowded with Marines from the assault waves trying to push inland, while landing craft continued to pour more men and equipment onto the narrow strip of land. Artillery rounds created geysers of black sand. Machine gun fire from hidden positions created a sound like angry hornets passing overhead. Mortar rounds exploded with a distinctive crump that sent shrapnel and volcanic debris in every direction. "Move! Keep moving!" Lieutenant Davis shouted, leading his men across the beach toward their designated assembly area. Several men were knocked down by the concussion of nearby explosions, the loose sand making it nearly impossible to maintain footing. A landing craft 40 yards to their left took a direct hit from an artillery shell, killing everyone still inside. The 8th Ammunition Company reached their assembly point, a slight depression in the beach that provided minimal cover, and immediately began organizing their operations. Their job was to establish ammunition dumps, which meant creating protected positions where ammunition could be stored and distributed. On normal beaches, this would involve digging pits and stacking sandbags. On Iwo Jima's volcanic sand, digging was nearly impossible. The sand simply flowed back into any hole like water. They adapted, using ammunition crates themselves to build walls and bunkers, stacking heavy wooden boxes to create barriers against shrapnel and small arms fire. For the next 4 hours, the 8th Ammunition Company worked under continuous fire. They formed human chains stretching from the waterline to the forward positions, passing crates of ammunition, boxes of grenades, cases of mortar rounds, jerry cans of water, and bundles of rations hand to hand. When Marines on the front lines ran low on ammunition, it was these men who brought it forward, running across open ground with heavy loads, while Japanese snipers and machine gunners targeted anyone who moved. Private First Class Harold Thompson, a 19-year-old from Detroit who had worked in his father's grocery store before enlisting, made 17 trips across the beach that first day. On his 9th trip, the Marine he was bringing ammunition to was hit by sniper fire 10 feet in front of him. Thompson dropped beside the wounded man, applied a pressure bandage to the injury, and called for a corpsman before continuing forward with the ammunition. On his 14th trip, he was knocked unconscious by the concussion from an artillery shell that landed 15 yards away. He woke up 2 minutes later, covered in volcanic sand, retrieved the scattered ammunition crates, and completed his delivery. "Why are you still moving?" a white Marine from the assault company asked him as Thompson dropped off a case of carbine ammunition. The Marine was sheltering behind a destroyed landing vehicle, his uniform torn and face blackened with powder residue. "You logistics guys are supposed to stay back at the dumps." Thompson was breathing hard from the exertion of moving through the sand while carrying 70 pounds of ammunition. "Marines on this beach need ammunition. We have ammunition. Simple mathematics." By 1400 hours, the situation on Beach Red 2 had deteriorated further. The initial assault waves had pushed approximately 200 yards inland, but were pinned down by intense fire from Japanese positions that had survived the naval bombardment. The beach itself was so crowded with men, equipment, and disabled vehicles that landing craft were having difficulty finding space to offload more supplies. Wounded Marines were accumulating at aid stations faster than they could be evacuated back to the ships. The entire operation was in danger of stalling before it could gain momentum. It was at this moment that the first crisis emerged for the 8th Ammunition Company. A white Marine infantry company fighting near the base of Mount Suribachi radioed that they were completely out of ammunition and about to be overrun. The Japanese had launched a counterattack from tunnel positions, and the Marines had expended all their rifle and machine gun ammunition holding them off. They needed resupply within minutes, or they would have to retreat, which would expose the entire southern flank of the beachhead. The problem was geography. To reach the infantry company, someone would have to cross 300 yards of completely exposed beach, then climb a steep embankment of loose volcanic sand, all while under direct observation from Japanese positions on Mount Suribachi. It was considered a suicide mission. 3 previous attempts by white Marines had resulted in all the volunteers being hit before they traveled 50 yards. Lieutenant Davis did not hesitate. "We are going." He assembled a 30-man team from the 8th Ammunition Company, each man carrying as much ammunition as he could physically transport. Sergeant Washington was among them, along with Corporal Mitchell and Private Thompson. They left behind their packs and anything non-essential, loading themselves down with bandoliers of rifle ammunition, boxes of machine gun belts, and satchels full of hand grenades. "I will not lie to you," Davis told them as they prepared to move out. "This is the worst thing I will ever ask you to do, but those Marines up there will die without ammunition, and we are the only ones who can get it to them. Stay spread out, keep moving. If someone goes down, the next man picks up his load and keeps going." Questions? There were no questions. The men of the 8th Ammunition Company had trained for 2 years to be the best at moving supplies under fire. Now they would prove it. They moved out at 14:20 hours, spread across a 100-yard front to minimize casualties from artillery. Japanese observers on Mount Suribachi spotted them immediately and directed fire onto the beach. Artillery shells began landing in sequence, walking across their line of advance. Machine gun fire kicked up volcanic sand around their feet. Mortar rounds created columns of black debris that fell like rain. Sergeant Washington ran through the chaos with 100 rounds of .30 caliber machine gun ammunition draped across his body and a case of grenades in his hands. The volcanic sand grabbed at his boots with every step, turning the sprint into a nightmare of slow motion. Beside him, a Marine he did not know was hit and went down. Washington kept running. 20 yards later, another Marine was killed by shrapnel. Washington kept running. His lungs burned, his legs screamed. The weight of the ammunition threatened to drag him down into the volcanic sand. He kept running. Private Thompson was hit in the leg by shrapnel 30 seconds after they started moving. He went down hard, the impact driving the breath from his lungs. For a moment, he lay there, stunned and disoriented. Then he remembered the wounded Marine he had treated earlier, remembered the way the man had looked at him with desperate hope when Thompson appeared with ammunition. Thompson struggled to his feet, redistributed his load to account for his injured leg, and continued forward with a limping run. He would make it across that beach, or he would die trying. But he would not quit. The 30-man team was reduced to 23 by the time they reached the embankment. They scrambled up the loose sand on hands and knees, volcanic debris cascading down behind them, and reached the desperate Marines at the top. The infantry company commander, a captain from Nebraska named Richards, stared at them in disbelief as they arrived and began distributing ammunition. "I thought you were logistics," Richards said to Lieutenant Davis, taking a bandolier of rifle ammunition and immediately beginning to distribute it to his men. "We are logistics," Davis replied, breathing hard. "This is what logistics looks like when it works." The Marines of the infantry company used the ammunition to break the Japanese counterattack and hold their position. The 8th Ammunition Company made it back across the exposed beach, collected more supplies, and did it again. And then again. Over the next 6 hours, they made 12 supply runs to forward positions, each time crossing ground that was under direct enemy observation and fire. By the end of the first day, 8 men from the 8th Ammunition Company had been killed and 31 wounded. but not a single Marine on Beach Red 2 ran out of ammunition. As darkness fell on Iwo Jima, the exhausted survivors of the 8th Ammunition Company dug shallow fighting positions in the volcanic sand and prepared for what they knew would be a sleepless night. Japanese infiltrators would probe the American lines after dark, and artillery would continue to fall randomly across the beach. Sergeant Washington sat in a shallow depression with Corporal Mitchell and Private Thompson, whose leg had been bandaged by a Navy corpsman, but who had refused evacuation. "My father told me the Marines would never let us fight," Mitchell said quietly, staring out at the dark ocean. "Said they would use us to carry supplies and that would be it, that we would spend the whole conflict loading trucks." "We carried supplies today," Washington replied. "We also fought." "You think anyone back home will hear about this?" Thompson asked. "You think the newspapers will tell them about what we did today?" Washington considered the question. He had been in the Marines long enough to understand how the system worked. The official reports would mention the 8th Ammunition Company's casualties in the statistics, but the story of their desperate supply runs would likely never be told. The newspapers wanted heroes who looked a certain way, and Black Marines did not fit the image they were selling. But something had changed on that beach today, and Washington knew it even if he could not fully articulate it yet. They had proven something to themselves and to the White Marines, who had watched them cross that killing ground again and again. They had proven something to the Japanese, who had poured fire onto them and failed to stop them. Most importantly, they had proven something to themselves. The battle for Iwo Jima continued for 36 more days. The 8th Ammunition Company remained on the island for the entire campaign, establishing and maintaining ammunition dumps, running supplies to forward units, and performing every task required of them under continuous fire. They lost 19 men killed and 78 wounded, a casualty rate higher than many frontline infantry units. But they never stopped working, never stopped delivering the supplies that kept the American advance moving forward. On the 4th day of the battle, something unprecedented happened. Their White Marine Infantry Company, that had been fighting near the 2nd airfield, ran critically low on ammunition during a Japanese counterattack. The call for resupply went out, and a team from the 8th Ammunition Company volunteered to make the run. The Marine Company commander, who had been skeptical of Black Marines' courage, watched through binoculars as 12 men from the 8th Ammunition Company crossed 600 yards of open ground under intense fire, delivered their supplies, and made it back. When the Ammunition Company team returned to their position, the infantry commander walked over personally to thank them. "I owe you and your men an apology," he told Lieutenant Davis. "I did not think you had it in you. I was wrong." Davis looked at the commander for a long moment before responding. "With respect, sir, we do not need your validation. We know what we are. But I hope you remember this the next time someone tells you what Black Marines can or cannot do." The story spread. White Marines who had fought alongside the men of the 8th Ammunition Company began to speak about what they had witnessed. Combat photographers captured images of Black Marines hauling supplies across the volcanic beaches under fire, though many of these photographs would not be published in American newspapers for years. More importantly, the Japanese defenders began to understand that the men attacking their positions came in many colors, all of them determined to take the island regardless of cost. Japanese commanders on Iwo Jima kept detailed records that would later be recovered from command bunkers. One entry from a Japanese colonel, dated February 23rd, described watching Negro soldiers working under fire on the beaches and noting their discipline and persistence. The colonel had been educated at American universities before the conflict and understood the racial dynamics of American society. He expressed surprise that America would send black troops into combat, believing the American propaganda that portrayed them as inferior. Watching them work under fire forced him to reconsider what he thought he knew about American society and military capability. On February 23rd, 4 days after the initial landing, Marines from the 28th Regiment reached the summit of Mount Suribachi and raised an American flag. The moment was captured in one of the most famous photographs of the conflict, and the image was transmitted around the world as proof that the American advance could not be stopped. What the photograph did not show were the supply lines that made that advance possible, the thousands of tons of ammunition, water, rations and equipment that had to be moved from ship to shore to frontline under continuous fire. The men of the 8th Ammunition Company were part of that invisible logistics network, and their contribution made the flag raising possible. The fighting on Iwo Jima was unlike anything the Marines had encountered in previous Pacific campaigns. The Japanese defenders had constructed an underground fortress with 11 miles of tunnels connecting 1,500 defensive positions. They had supplies and ammunition to last for months. They had orders to kill 10 Americans for every Japanese soldier who died. They fought with suicidal determination, and every yard of ground had to be taken in brutal close-quarters fighting. Through it all, the 8th Ammunition Company maintained the supply lines. They established ammunition dumps at the front lines, moving forward as the American advance pushed north across the island. They worked during the day under artillery fire and at night under the threat of infiltrators. They hauled crates of ammunition up steep volcanic slopes, through fields of volcanic rock that shredded boots and cut hands, across ground churned into a nightmare landscape by artillery and bombs. They did the work that no one celebrated, but that everyone depended on. Private First Class Thompson, still recovering from his leg wound, made 317 individual supply runs during the campaign. He kept a small notebook where he tracked every trip, what he carried, where he took it, whether the recipient lived or died. By the end of the campaign, the notebook was filled with entries in cramped handwriting, each one representing a moment when ammunition reached a Marine who needed it. Thompson never shared the notebook with anyone, but he kept it for the rest of his life as a reminder of what he and his fellow Marines had accomplished. Sergeant Washington was recommended for the Bronze Star for his actions on the first day of the battle. The recommendation worked its way up the chain of command and was eventually approved, making him one of the few black Marines to receive a valor decoration during the conflict. When the medal was presented to him in a brief ceremony on Iwo Jima, Washington accepted it quietly and then went back to work. He understood that the medal was important not because of what it meant to him personally, but because of what it meant for every black Marine who came after him. It was proof that courage and competence could not be denied forever, even by a system built on discrimination. The battle for Iwo Jima officially ended on March 26, 1945, 36 days after it began. The cost had been staggering: 6,821 Americans killed and 19,217 wounded, making it one of the bloodiest battles in Marine Corps history. Of the 21,000 Japanese defenders, only 1,083 survived to be taken prisoner. The rest fought to the death in their underground fortresses. The island had cost nearly 1 American casualty for every yard of ground captured. The 8th Marine Ammunition Company departed Iwo Jima on March 30th, boarding transport ships that would take them back to Hawaii for rest and refit. They left behind 19 graves in the military cemetery that had been established on the island, 19 men who had volunteered to fight for a country that did not grant them full citizenship, 19 men who had proven their courage in the most difficult circumstances imaginable. The survivors carried their memories and their scars back to a nation that was not yet ready to acknowledge what they had done. In the immediate aftermath of Iwo Jima, the story of the 8th Ammunition Company's performance received minimal coverage in the American press. The newspapers were filled with stories about white Marine heroes, about dramatic individual actions and acts of valor. The systematic courage of black Marines performing their duties under fire was not considered newsworthy by editors who served a reading public still comfortable with segregation. The official Marine Corps histories of the battle mentioned the Ammunition Company in passing, noting their casualties but not their actions. But among the Marines who had fought on Iwo Jima, the story spread. Combat veterans told other Marines about what they had witnessed, about black Marines crossing killing grounds again and again to bring ammunition forward, about their discipline under fire, about their refusal to quit even when the situation seemed hopeless. These stories circulated through the Marine Corps, carried by men who had seen the truth with their own eyes and could not reconcile it with the official position that black Marines were only fit for labor duties. Slowly, incrementally, the perception began to change. More black Marines were trained and assigned to frontline units. The performance of the 8th Ammunition Company and other segregated black units in the Pacific provided evidence that could not be dismissed by those who wanted to maintain segregation. It would take 2 more years and a presidential order to officially desegregate the military. But the seeds of that change were planted on beaches like Iwo Jima by men like Sergeant Washington, Corporal Mitchell, and Private Thompson. For the Japanese, the lesson of Iwo Jima was different but equally significant. They had believed their fortress island was impregnable, that American forces would be unable to sustain the casualties necessary to capture it. They had underestimated American industrial capacity, the ability to produce endless supplies of ammunition, equipment, and vehicles, and American determination. The presence of black Marines in combat roles confused Japanese intelligence officers who believed American racial propaganda and expected African Americans to be unwilling or unable to fight. The reality they encountered, Marines of all backgrounds working together under fire with shared competence and courage, suggested an America more unified and capable than their intelligence had led them to believe. One Japanese officer, interviewed after being captured, expressed surprise at the racial diversity he had observed among American forces. He had been educated to believe that racial division was America's fundamental weakness, the thing that would prevent them from sustaining a long conflict. Watching racially integrated forces work together efficiently under fire forced him to reconsider these assumptions. If America could mobilize and deploy forces of such diversity with such effectiveness, then Japan's strategy of wearing down American will through brutal attrition was fundamentally flawed. The volcanic island of Iwo Jima served as a base for American bombers for the remainder of the conflict. The lives lost capturing it were justified, in military terms, by the thousands of American airmen who made emergency landings there and were saved. But for the men who fought on those black sand beaches, the island meant something more. It was where courage was proven, where assumptions were shattered, where men discovered what they were capable of when everything else was stripped away. Sergeant Timms Washington returned to Birmingham, Alabama, after the conflict ended. He found a city largely unchanged by the events that had transformed his life. The steel mills were still there. The segregated water fountains were still there. The laws that prevented him from voting were still there. But Washington himself was changed. He had crossed killing grounds on a volcanic island half a world away. He had led Marines under fire. He had been decorated for valor by a military that officially considered him a second-class citizen. He refused to accept the limitations that Birmingham tried to impose on him. Washington became involved in the early civil rights movement, using his status as a decorated Marine veteran to challenge segregation laws. When police told him to move to the back of a bus, he cited his military service and refused. When voting registrars tried to prevent him from registering, he showed them his Bronze Star and demanded his rights as a citizen. He was arrested 17 times for various acts of civil disobedience, and each time he told the arresting officers about Iwo Jima, about the Marines of all races who fought there, about the futility of trying to maintain segregation when black Americans had proven their worth in the most extreme circumstances imaginable. Corporal James Mitchell returned to Baltimore and found work again on the docks. He never spoke about Iwo Jima to his civilian co-workers, never mentioned his military service unless directly asked. But he carried himself differently than before the conflict. He had learned on those volcanic beaches that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite fear. He had learned that the opinions of people who never faced real danger were worth precisely nothing. He had learned that he and men like him were capable of anything when properly trained and led. These lessons shaped the rest of his life. Private First Class Harold Thompson completed his enlistment and used the benefits available to veterans to attend college, becoming one of the first members of his family to receive higher education. He studied history and education, eventually becoming a teacher in Detroit's public schools. For 32 years, he taught American history to students from all backgrounds, and every year when he reached the section on World War II, he told them about Iwo Jima. Not the famous story of the flag raising, but the lesser-known story of men who carried ammunition across volcanic sand under fire because Marines depended on them. He showed his students the notebook he had kept, the record of 317 supply runs, and let them calculate the tons of ammunition he had personally moved. He wanted them to understand that history was made by ordinary people doing difficult jobs, not just by the heroes who appeared in textbooks. Lieutenant James Davis continued his career in the Marine Corps after the conflict, becoming one of the few white officers who actively advocated for desegregation of the service. He cited his experience with the 8th Ammunition Company repeatedly in official reports and recommendations, pointing out that segregated units were militarily inefficient and that individual merit, not race, should determine assignments. His advocacy made him unpopular with some senior officers who preferred to maintain the status quo, but Davis believed the men he had led on Iwo Jima deserved better than a military that wasted their talents on the basis of skin color. The official desegregation of the American military came in 1948 when President Truman signed Executive Order 9981. The order was controversial and faced significant resistance from officers who believed integration would harm military effectiveness. But the evidence from units like the 8th Ammunition Company, evidence of black Marines performing with distinction under the most difficult circumstances, could not be ignored by those who examined the record honestly. The integration process was slow and uneven, taking years to implement fully, but it represented a fundamental shift in American military policy. For the Japanese, the ultimate lesson of Iwo Jima came months later when American forces invaded Okinawa and then when atomic weapons were used against Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The industrial and military capacity that had enabled America to capture a fortress island like Iwo Jima, to absorb horrific casualties and continue advancing, to mobilize diverse populations into effective military force. That same capacity made continued resistance futile. The conflict ended in August 1945 with Japan's surrender. In the decades after the conflict, historians began to examine the contributions of African American service members more carefully. The story of the 8th Ammunition Company gradually emerged from obscurity as researchers interviewed veterans and examined unit records. Documentaries were produced, books were written. The men who had been invisible in 1945 slowly became visible as America confronted its own history of racial discrimination. In 1995, 50 years after the battle, survivors of the 8th Ammunition Company returned to Iwo Jima for a commemoration ceremony. Among them were Washington, Mitchell, and Thompson, now elderly men returning to the place where they had been young and tested and transformed. They walked across beaches that had been killing grounds, now peaceful and empty. They visited the American cemetery where their fallen comrades were buried. They stood on ground they had fought for and remembered friends who had not lived to grow old. A Japanese veteran was present at the ceremony, a former Imperial Army soldier who had defended Iwo Jima. Through a translator, he spoke to the American veterans, expressing respect for their courage and acknowledging the horror all of them had endured. When he learned that the black Marines present had been segregated and treated as inferior by their own military, he expressed genuine surprise. "You fought like tigers," he said through the translator. "We feared you as much as any Marine. To learn that your own country did not honor you as you deserved is shameful." The comment stayed with Washington for the rest of his life. It encapsulated something he had understood since 1945, but rarely articulated: that courage in combat could not guarantee justice at home, that fighting for your country did not automatically earn you the rights of full citizenship, that the struggle for equality was separate from the struggle for military victory. But it also reminded him why the fight had been necessary. Every time a black Marine performed with distinction, every time a segregated unit proved itself in combat, it made the argument for equality harder to dismiss. The men of the 8th Ammunition Company had not fought on Iwo Jima to end segregation. They had fought because Marines depended on them. But their performance had contributed to a larger change that eventually came. The volcanic island of Iwo Jima today is largely uninhabited, administered by Japan, but rarely visited except by veterans and historians. The beaches where the 8th Ammunition Company worked under fire are quiet now, the black volcanic sand undisturbed except by wind and waves. The fortifications that Japanese defenders built with such care are slowly crumbling back into the rock. Nature is reclaiming an island that was briefly transformed into one of history's most intense battlefields. But the story of what happened there, the story of men who were told they were inferior but proved themselves equals, the story of courage demonstrated under circumstances that tested everyone regardless of background. The story of a military slowly learning that competence has no color. That story remains. It is preserved in the memories of veterans, in the records of military historians, in the lessons taught to new generations of Marines about the debt they owe to those who came before. The men of the 8th Marine Ammunition Company fought for a country that did not fully embrace them. They served in a military that officially considered them second class. They performed their duties with distinction, under circumstances that would have broken lesser men. And in doing so, they proved something that should never have needed proof, but that their country required them to demonstrate, that courage, competence, and commitment to fellow Marines transcended the artificial barriers that segregation tried to impose. When Sergeant Timms Washington died in 2008 at the age of 87, his obituary mentioned his Bronze Star and his service on Iwo Jima. At his funeral, 3 Marines from the integrated, modern Marine Corps attended in dress uniform to honor a veteran whose service had helped make their careers possible. They did not know him personally. Washington had been retired for 63 years when he died, but they knew his story. They knew what he had done on a volcanic island in 1945, how he had led men under fire, how he had helped break down barriers that should never have existed. They came to his funeral because Marines honor their own, and Washington had been a Marine when it mattered most. The black volcanic beaches of Iwo Jima claimed thousands of lives in 1945. The island tested every man who fought there, regardless of rank or race or background. It tested courage, endurance, determination, and will. The men of the 8th Ammunition Company passed that test as completely as any Marines who fought in that campaign. They carried supplies under fire. They ran across killing grounds because other Marines depended on them. They refused to quit when quitting would have been understandable. They proved what should have been obvious, but what their country needed to see demonstrated: that the color of a Marine's skin had nothing to do with the content of his character or the depth of his courage. The Japanese defenders of Iwo Jima believed their fortress was impregnable. They believed American forces lacked the will to pay the price necessary to capture it. They believed the racial divisions in American society would prevent effective military action. They were wrong on every count, and part of what proved them wrong were black Marines carrying ammunition across volcanic sand under fire again and again without complaint or hesitation, because that was the job they had been given, and they refused to do it poorly. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.